Ever had someone claim they loved you while doubting your potential? Tap that like button. Subscribe if you believe that the people who leave you during your struggle don't deserve to witness your success, because what I'm about to tell you proves that sometimes the person who abandons you at your lowest becomes the biggest regret of their life when they discover what you built without them. My name is Autumn. I'm 35 years old. And the day my husband's lawyer contacted mine demanding financial disclosure during our divorce was the day I realized he had no idea who I'd become while he was busy planning his exit. He thought he was divorcing a broke, failed entrepreneur with nothing to show for 3 years of work. He had no clue he was actually divorcing a multimillionaire whose company was about to change an entire industry. But before I tell you about the moment he discovered the truth, let me take you back to where love died and ambition was born. I met Garrett Walsh when I was 27 years old at a marketing conference in Chicago. I was working as a digital strategist for a mid-sized agency, building campaigns for clients and dreaming about eventually starting my own business. Garrett was a financial analyst at an investment firm, confident and charming in that way men with good salaries and better haircuts often are. He approached me at the networking reception with a glass of wine and a smile that promised adventure. We talked for 3 hours that night about ambition, career goals, and what success meant to us. He said he admired driven women, and that he found ambition attractive. I believed him because I wanted to. We started dating long distance, him in Boston and me in New York. 6 months of weekend visits and expensive phone bills later, Garrett got transferred to the New York office. He moved into my apartment within 2 months. We got married a year and a half after we met in a ceremony his parents paid for because they insisted on a wedding befitting their son's status. I didn't care about the fancy venue or designer dress. I was in love with a man who seemed to support my dreams as much as I supported his. For the first 2 years of marriage, everything seemed perfect. We both worked demanding jobs, came home exhausted, and spent weekends recovering while planning futures we'd build together. I was promoted to senior strategist. Garrett was made vice president. We bought a condo in a decent neighborhood and talked about kids someday, after we'd both established our careers. Then I made the decision that changed everything. I told Garrett I wanted to quit my job and start my own company. I'd been developing an idea for over a year, working nights and weekends on a business plan that kept me awake with excitement. My concept was a software platform that helped small businesses manage customer relationships more effectively than existing expensive systems. I'd validated the idea with dozens of small business owners who were desperate for affordable solutions. I taught myself basic coding and built a prototype. I'd even secured a meeting with a potential angel investor who liked what I was building. All I needed was time to develop it properly, which meant leaving my stable job and salary. Garrett's response was immediate and negative. "That's a terrible idea," he said flatly. "You're throwing away a good career for something that will probably fail. Most startups don't make it past year 1. I tried to explain my research, my validation, my confidence in the market. He cut me off with statistics about failure rates and lectures about financial responsibility. "We're married now, Autumn," he said. "Your choices affect both of us. What happens when this idea fails and we can't pay our mortgage?" I'd saved enough to cover 6 months of living expenses, I argued. And I'd be drawing a minimal salary once we got investor funding. Garrett shook his head like I was a child proposing something ridiculous. "I won't support this. If you quit your job, you're on your own financially. I'll cover the mortgage and basic bills, but don't expect me to fund your little experiment." His dismissiveness stung, but I was too excited about my idea to let his doubt stop me. I quit my job 3 weeks later. Garrett was furious but tried to hide it behind passive-aggressive comments about my unemployment and pointed questions about when I'd start making money again. I spent the next 6 months working 18-hour days building my platform. I lived on coffee and determination, coding features, reaching out to potential customers, pitching investors, and slowly, painfully making progress. My angel investor came through with $50,000. I used it to hire a developer and a part-time salesperson. We launched a beta version to 20 small businesses who'd agreed to test the platform. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. They loved the interface, the affordability, the way it solved problems the expensive systems ignored. Within 3 months, we had 50 paying customers. Within 6 months, we had 200. Revenue was still modest, barely enough to pay my tiny team and cover basic expenses. I was taking home less than $15,000 a year, a fraction of my previous salary. Garrett watched this progress with thinly veiled contempt. He'd stopped asking about my work after the first few months when it became clear I wasn't going to quit and get a real job as he'd suggested repeatedly. Instead, he started making comments about my appearance, my schedule, and my contributions to our household. "You're home all day but the laundry isn't done," he'd say. Or, "It must be nice to work in your pajamas while some of us have real jobs." Each comment was a small cut, but I was too focused on building my company to address the growing rift in our marriage. By the end of year 1, my startup, called ConnectEase, had 400 customers and annual revenue of $600,000. We were profitable barely but growing steadily. I was finally able to pay myself a reasonable salary, $40,000, still less than I'd made at the agency but enough to contribute to household expenses again. I thought Garrett would be impressed. Instead, he seemed annoyed that I was succeeding despite his predictions of failure. Year 2 was transformational for ConnectEase. We hit product-market fit in a way that exceeded my wildest projections. Small businesses were desperate for what we offered, and word spread quickly through business networks and online communities. We grew from 400 customers to 3,000. Revenue jumped from $600,000 to $8 million. We needed to scale quickly to meet demand, which meant raising significant venture capital. I spent months pitching investors, refining our business model, and building relationships with venture capital firms. The process was exhausting and often humiliating. Investors, mostly men, would question my technical knowledge, my leadership ability, my commitment to the business. Some asked if I planned to have children soon, as if that was relevant to my company's viability. Others suggested I hire a male CEO to make the business more attractive to investors. I pushed through every insulting meeting, every rejection, every assumption that I wasn't capable of leading a rapidly growing tech company. Meanwhile, at home, my marriage was disintegrating. Garrett had started working late frequently, going out with colleagues, and generally avoiding me. When we were together, he was critical and distant. Our conversations had become transactional. "Did you pay the electric bill? What time will you be home? I scheduled us for couples therapy next month." He canceled the therapy appointment, claiming work was too busy. I rescheduled. He canceled again. After the third cancellation, I stopped trying. 15 months into year 2, I finally closed a series of funding round. $10 million from a prestigious venture capital firm led by a woman named Octavia, who understood exactly what I was building and why it mattered. The day the money hit our company bank account, I came home excited to share the news with Garrett. Maybe this would finally make him see what I'd accomplished, make him proud instead of resentful. He was packing a suitcase when I walked into our bedroom. My excitement drained instantly, replaced by cold dread. "What's happening?" I asked quietly. Garrett didn't look at me as he folded shirts into the bag. "I'm staying at a hotel for a while. We need space." "Space from what?" I demanded. "From this," he said, gesturing vaguely at me. "From you working all the time, from your obsession with this company, from feeling like I'm married to someone who doesn't have time for an actual relationship." "I just closed a $10 million funding round," I said, my voice rising. "I came home to celebrate with you." Garrett finally looked at me, his expression cold. "Congratulations. That doesn't change the fact that you've been a terrible wife for 2 years. You're never available, never present, always thinking about work. I'm tired of competing with your company for your attention." I stared at this man I'd loved, this man who'd promised to support my ambitions, and saw a stranger. "You told me you admired ambition," I said quietly. "I do," he replied. "In moderation. Not when it consumes everything else." He left that night. I sat in our empty condo, surrounded by the success I'd worked so hard to build, and felt completely alone. Over the next 2 months, Garrett stayed at his hotel, claiming he needed time to think. We'd meet occasionally for tense dinners where he'd list everything wrong with me and our marriage. I was too focused on work, too unavailable emotionally, too changed from the woman he'd married. I tried to explain that building a company required sacrifice, that this intensity was temporary, that I still loved him. He didn't want to hear it. During this separation, ConnectEase continued to explode. We grew from 3,000 customers to 8,000. Revenue hit 15 million annually. We were hiring rapidly, moving into real office space, getting written about in tech publications. I was working 16-hour days managing growth while trying to save my marriage. Looking back, I should have seen what was coming. But I was too exhausted and heartbroken to recognize the obvious signs. 4 months after Garrett moved out, he asked me to meet him at a coffee shop near his office. I showed up hoping he wanted to reconcile, ready to discuss how we could rebuild our marriage now that the company was more stable. Instead, he slid divorce papers across the table. "I'm filing for divorce," he said calmly. "This isn't working. I can't be married to someone who prioritizes her career over everything else." I stared at the documents, feeling my world tilt sideways. "We can fix this," I said desperately. "I can adjust my schedule, we can go to counseling, we can." "I've already filed," he interrupted. "My lawyer says the process should be straightforward since we don't have kids and you don't make much money anyway. The prenup should make division of assets simple." That last comment struck me as odd. I don't make much money. Garrett had no idea what ConnectEase was actually worth. He'd stopped asking about my company months ago, dismissing it as my little hobby that kept me busy. He didn't know about the funding round, the explosive growth, the fact that my equity stake in a company now valued at $70 million made me wealthier than he'd ever be. And at that moment, I decided not to tell him. I signed the papers silently, agreeing to meet with lawyers the following week. Garrett looked relieved that I wasn't fighting, that I was making this easy for him. He had no idea what easy actually meant. I left that coffee shop and called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Beatrice who'd handled my company's legal formation. "I need you to represent me in my divorce," I told her. "And I need you to be very strategic about how we disclose my assets." Beatrice understood immediately. She'd watched ConnectEase grow from an idea to a multimillion-dollar company. She knew exactly what I was worth and what was at stake. Over the next 2 weeks, Garrett's lawyer sent initial paperwork requesting financial disclosure. The forms asked about income, assets, business interests, and net worth. Beatrice responded with information that was technically accurate but carefully limited. She disclosed my salary, $40,000 annually, which was true. She disclosed my small personal savings account with $8,000, also true. She disclosed our shared condo equity, about $60,000 after the mortgage. What she didn't disclose yet was my equity stake in ConnectEase, which was held in a separate legal structure that didn't have to be revealed until formal discovery. Garrett's lawyer reviewed these numbers and reported back to Garrett that his soon-to-be ex-wife was essentially broke. I learned later from a mutual friend that Garrett had been openly telling people he was divorcing me because I'd failed at my business and become financially dependent on him. He claimed he couldn't be married to someone so irresponsible with money, someone who'd thrown away a good career for a company that barely generated income. The narrative he'd constructed painted him as the victim who'd supported a wife's failed dreams long enough. His friends commiserated. His mother reportedly said he was better off without someone so foolish. And through it all, I stayed silent. I didn't correct the story. I didn't announce my company's valuation. I just kept working, kept growing ConnectEase, and waited for the inevitable moment when truth would collide with Garrett's assumptions. That moment came 6 weeks into the divorce process. Garrett's lawyer filed a motion requesting comprehensive financial discovery, including detailed business valuations. California was a community property state. Any assets acquired during marriage were subject to division. Garrett's lawyer wanted to make sure I wasn't hiding anything valuable. Beatrice called me the day she received the motion. Her voice was gleeful. "They just opened the door for us to disclose everything. Are you ready for this?" "I'm ready," I said. Let's show them exactly what they're divorcing. Beatrice filed our response 3 days later. It included a certified business valuation from a reputable firm showing ConnectEase was worth $70 million. It included documentation of my equity stake 65% ownership, making my share worth approximately $45 million. It included financial statements showing company revenue, growth trajectory, and profitability. And it included a very polite note stating that per California community property law, Garrett was entitled to claim a portion of the business value accrued during our marriage. The response was delivered to Garrett's lawyer on a Friday afternoon. Beatrice predicted we'd hear back Monday morning. She was right. Garrett's lawyer called at 9 a.m. demanding an emergency meeting. We agreed to meet that Wednesday at a neutral conference room downtown. I arrived at that meeting wearing a tailored suit I'd bought specifically for investor pitches and board meetings. I looked like the CEO I'd become, not the struggling entrepreneur Garrett remembered. Garrett was already there, sitting next to his lawyer with an expression somewhere between shock and rage. His face went red when I walked in. "You lied to me," he said immediately, ignoring his lawyer's hand on his arm trying to calm him. "I never lied," I said calmly, sitting across from him. "You never asked. You stopped asking about my company over a year ago. You dismissed it as a hobby, called it my little experiment, told everyone I'd failed. I just didn't correct your assumptions." Garrett's lawyer, a stern man named Felix, cleared his throat. "Miss Autumn, your financial disclosure shows significant assets that weren't included in initial paperwork." His tone was accusatory, but Beatrice shut it down immediately. "We disclosed exactly what was required at each stage of discovery. Your client's motion requested comprehensive valuation. We provided it. Everything is legal and by the book." Felix's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. He'd walked into this himself by assuming I had nothing worth hiding. Now he had to figure out how to get his client a piece of a company worth tens of millions of dollars. "This is ridiculous," Garrett burst out. "You can't just hide a company from me." "I didn't hide anything," I replied. "You simply didn't care enough to pay attention. You were too busy telling people I was broke and foolish to actually look at what I was building." The meeting devolved into accusations and legal posturing. Garrett claimed he'd supported me financially during the company's early days, that his income had allowed me to take risks. Technically true, but my lawyer pointed out that his support amounted to covering household expenses I'd previously split with him, not direct investment in the business. He had no ownership stake, no formal contribution to ConnectEase beyond basic household support that didn't meet the legal threshold for business partnership. Still, California community property law meant Garrett could claim a portion of the company's value accrued during our marriage. Beatrice had prepared for this. She'd hired a forensic accountant who'd calculated exactly how much of ConnectEase's value was generated during the marriage versus before or after separation. The numbers were complex, but the conclusion was clear. Approximately 30% of the company's current value could be attributed to the period when Garrett and I were married and cohabitating. 30% of $70 million was $21 million. Half of that, $10.5 million, could theoretically be Garrett's share under community property laws. Garrett's face lit up when Felix explained this calculation. He thought he'd just won a lottery ticket, that divorcing his supposedly broke wife was about to make him a multimillionaire. But Beatrice wasn't finished. She slid another document across the table. "This is our counter-proposal," she said calmly. The document outlined a settlement offer. $2 million cash, paid in quarterly installments over 2 years. In exchange, Garrett would relinquish all claims to ConnectEase, including any future growth or equity. "That's insulting," Felix said immediately. "My client is entitled to over $10 million based on community property calculations." "Your client is entitled to argue his case in court," Beatrice replied smoothly. "Which will take 2 to 3 years, cost both parties hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and might result in a judge awarding him significantly less than our offer. Or he can accept $2 million, a life-changing amount of money for doing essentially nothing while my client built a company from scratch." The meeting ended with no resolution. Garrett left furious, convinced he deserved millions more. I left exhausted but satisfied that the truth was finally out. Over the next 3 months, the divorce became increasingly contentious. Garrett's lawyer filed motion after motion trying to prove he deserved a larger settlement. They argued he'd provided essential emotional support, that his stable income had reduced my financial stress, allowing me to focus on the company, that his belief in me, despite evidence to the contrary, had contributed to my success. Each argument was more ridiculous than the last, and each one was systematically dismantled by Beatrice and our forensic accountant. The most painful part wasn't the legal battle. It was watching Garrett's true character emerge. He gave interviews to business bloggers claiming I'd stolen his ideas. He told friends I'd hidden assets to defraud him. He showed up at my office building, causing a scene until security escorted him out. The man I'd loved had transformed into someone I didn't recognize, someone motivated entirely by greed and wounded ego. Meanwhile, ConnectEase kept growing. We hit 12,000 customers and $25 million in annual revenue. A major tech company approached us about acquisition. The offer was staggering, $120 million. I brought the offer to my board. They advised me to wait, to keep building, to aim for an even larger exit in 2 years. But I was tired. Tired of the divorce battle. Tired of Garrett's constant interference. Tired of having my personal life dissected in legal documents. I accepted the acquisition offer with one condition. The deal would close after my divorce was finalized. I didn't want Garrett getting a penny from the acquisition, only from the company's value during our marriage. The acquiring company agreed. We set a closing date 6 months out, contingent on divorce settlement. This deadline gave Garrett's lawyer new leverage. They knew I wanted the divorce finished before the acquisition closed. They assumed I'd be willing to pay more to expedite the process. They were wrong. I instructed Beatrice to hold firm on our $2 million offer. If Garrett wanted to drag this out, fine. I'd cancel the acquisition and keep building. I had all the leverage now, and Garrett's lawyer knew it. 2 weeks before the acquisition closing date, Felix called Beatrice with a settlement proposal. Garrett would accept $3 million, paid in a lump sum, with no future claims to ConnectEase or any subsequent sale. It was more than our initial offer but far less than the $10 million Garrett had initially demanded. Beatrice called me for approval. "It's a reasonable compromise," she said. "You get a clean break and closure before the acquisition. $3 million is nothing compared to what you're about to make." I thought about it for exactly 5 seconds. "No," I said. "Our original offer stands. $2 million or nothing." "But Autumn," she protested. "This could drag out for months if you reject this." "I'm aware," I replied. "But Garrett doesn't get to hold me hostage. He wanted this divorce. He dismissed my company as worthless. He told everyone I was broke and foolish. He doesn't get to profit substantially from those mistakes now that he knows the truth." Beatrice went back to Felix with my response. The rejection caught them off guard. They'd assumed I was desperate to close the deal. They had 48 hours to respond before our offer expired. For 2 days I heard nothing. Then on day 2 Beatrice called. "They accepted," she said, disbelief in her voice. $2 million, your original offer. Garrett signed the settlement agreement this morning. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later in a courthouse that smelled like floor polish and regret. Garrett showed up with his lawyer, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. I showed up with Beatrice, wearing another power suit and the quiet confidence of someone who'd won on every metric that mattered. The judge reviewed our settlement agreement, confirmed both parties understood and accepted the terms, and signed the final divorce decree. Just like that, my marriage was over. Garrett left without speaking to me. I watched him walk away and felt nothing but relief. 2 months later, the ConnectEase acquisition closed. $120 million, with my 65% stake translating to $78 million before taxes. After taxes, legal fees, and other expenses, I walked away with approximately $48 million. At 32 years old, I was wealthier than I'd ever imagined possible. The acquisition made tech news headlines. Business publications wrote articles about the deal, about ConnectEase's impressive growth trajectory, about me as a female founder who'd successfully exited in a male-dominated industry. Garrett's name appeared in exactly 0 of these articles. The news coverage included interviews where I talked about building the company, the challenges I'd faced, the persistence required to succeed as a woman in tech. Reporters asked about my support system. I talked about my investors, my team, my advisors. I never mentioned Garrett. Not once. He'd wanted to be divorced from my failure. Now he was divorced from my success too. I heard through mutual friends that Garrett was bitter, angry, convinced he'd been cheated despite receiving $2 million for essentially doing nothing. His friends apparently thought I owed him more, that wives should share their success with supportive husbands. The irony was delicious. Garrett hadn't been supportive. He'd been dismissive, contemptuous, and ultimately absent. He'd left me during the hardest years, when the company was struggling and uncertain. He didn't get to claim credit or compensation for success, he'd actively discouraged. With my acquisition money, I started an angel investment fund focused on women-led startups. I wanted to be the investor I'd wished for when I was starting out. Someone who believed in female founders and didn't ask insulting questions about childcare plans. I invested in 12 companies that first year, offering not just capital but mentorship and network connections. Watching these women build their dreams reminded me why I'd pushed through all the difficulty, all the doubt, all the nights wondering if I was crazy for believing in myself. I also started speaking publicly about my experience. Not to bash Garrett specifically, but to talk honestly about what happens when partners can't handle each other's success, when support comes with conditions, when love is contingent on staying small enough not to threaten egos. The response was overwhelming. Women reached out constantly sharing their own stories of partners who'd left during struggle or couldn't handle success. Men reached out too, admitting they'd been like Garrett, threatened by ambitious partners and ashamed of their reactions. These conversations became the foundation for a book I wrote about building success while navigating relationship challenges. It became a bestseller in the business memoir category. And through it all, Garrett remained conspicuously silent, presumably spending his $2 million while watching my success compound without him. 3 years after our divorce, I ran into Garrett at a tech conference. I was a keynote speaker discussing female entrepreneurship and angel investing. He was attending as a regular participant, his face carefully neutral when our paths crossed in the hallway. "Autumn," he said stiffly. "Garrett," I replied with polite distance. "How are you?" He looked older, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I'm fine," he said. "Congratulations on everything. The book, the fund, all of it." "Thank you," I said simply. We stood there for an awkward moment before he spoke again. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About everything. About your company, about you, about what you were capable of. I know you probably don't care, but I needed to say it." "You're right," I said gently. "I don't care. Not because I'm cruel, but because your opinion stopped mattering the moment you chose to leave instead of stay, to doubt instead of believe. You made your choice, Garrett. Now you get to live with it." I walked away without looking back, heading toward a conference room full of entrepreneurs who believed what I'd proven, that the people who underestimate you don't deserve to witness your triumph. If this story reminded you that success built despite someone's doubt tastes sweeter than success built with their support, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about resilience, vindication, and becoming so successful that your doubters become your footnotes. Drop a comment about someone who underestimated you and how you proved them wrong. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't rubbing success in someone's face. It's building something so undeniable they can't help but see it from whatever distance they chose to put between you. See you in the next story.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoy watching Karma, Payback, come full circle every week, we dive into tales of betrayal and poetic justice. Don't miss the next one. Tap the subscribe button and join the Revenge Squad.